My name is Eleanor Wade. I am 68 years old, a retired elementary school teacher, and a widow of 13 years. For decades, my life was built on routines, on patience, on the quiet belief that the people you nurture will always protect you when the time comes. I raised my only daughter, Rachel, and later her little girl, Sophie, inside the walls of this weathered house on the Maine coast. This place was supposed to be a sanctuary, the one spot in the world where loyalty could never be questioned. That illusion ended with a single phone call. It was early morning. The kettle had just whistled. Steam curled from the spout like a breath in the cold air. I poured the tea into my favorite mug, the one with a faded blue rim, and carried it to the kitchen table. I had not yet taken a sip when the phone rang. I answered without thinking. Rachel's voice burst into my ear, high-pitched and unsteady. "Mom, what did you do? All the money is gone. Jake just got fired. The police are on their way here." She was almost gasping between words, like she had been running. The clatter of voices in the background, male and sharp, female and nervous, told me she wasn't alone. I kept the phone at my ear but let my eyes drift toward the staircase. Sophie was there, sitting cross-legged at the top step. Her laptop balanced on her knees. The screen's glow washed her young face in a pale silver light. She looked straight at me, unblinking, and then, unexpectedly, she smiled. "Grandma, don't worry," she said, her tone soft and calm, so ordinary it was almost jarring. "I already set the trap." The words didn't match her age. They belonged to someone who had been planning something for a long time. My fingers tightened around the phone. On the other end, Rachel's voice cracked into a desperate plea. "You don't understand. They froze Jake's accounts. He says we're ruined. We can't even pay for a motel room. Tell me what you did." I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I turned my mind back to 3 days earlier. The sound of a suitcase thumping against the upstairs floor had startled me out of folding laundry. I climbed the steps to find Rachel throwing clothes into a black carry-on, her movements frantic and careless. She didn't look at me when I stepped into the doorway. "I'm going to Boston for a while," she said, zipping the bag with a sharp jerk. "Jake needs me right now." I had asked about Sophie. She waved a hand without turning. "You can handle her. You always do." Her perfume lingered in the hallway long after the front door closed. That night, I logged into my bank account, more out of habit than suspicion. The screen loaded and my breath caught. The balance that had taken a lifetime to build. Money from my years of teaching, my husband's careful savings, the cushion that kept me from fear, was almost gone. Only a few dollars remained where tens of thousands had been. I remember sitting there, staring at the numbers, a cold weight settling in my chest. I had not yet formed the words to describe what I felt. Betrayal is too neat a word for that kind of wound. Now, in the present, Rachel's voice dragged me back. She was crying openly, her breaths coming in short bursts. "Mom, please, we're in trouble. They're saying someone filed reports. Someone went through our emails, our accounts. It's like they know everything." I looked again at Sophie. Her gaze was steady, her hands poised over the keyboard. She tapped a final command, then closed the laptop with deliberate care. "So," I said into the phone, my voice low and measured, "the trap has sprung, hasn't it?" There was a beat of silence on the other end. "What trap? What are you talking about?" I didn't explain. Some truths don't need to be spoken aloud when the person hearing them already feels their weight. Sophie rose from the stairs and walked past me into the kitchen, her bare feet silent on the worn floorboards. She opened the refrigerator, poured herself a glass of milk, and leaned against the counter as if this were just another morning. Rachel's voice was trembling now, brittle with panic. "Mom, please, you have to help us. Jake says if we can just get to Florida, we can start over. But we need money. We need you." I set my mug down without taking a sip. My eyes met Sophie's, and in that silent exchange, I knew we had crossed into a different kind of day. The day everything fell apart for Rachel was the day I realized I was not fighting alone anymore. fade to black. When the line went dead and the kitchen fell silent, I stood there for a long moment, my hand still resting on the cool ceramic of my mug. The smell of steeped tea had already faded into the air. Outside, gulls cried over the harbor, their voices sharp against the gray morning. I turned away from the phone and let my eyes wander to the far corner of the living room where the summer jar sat on its shelf. It was nothing fancy, just a wide glass jar with a wooden lid, the kind you could find in any secondhand store. The words "Summer Fund" were painted on the front in faded blue, the letters chipped in places. I had bought it the summer Rachel turned 8 after my husband Charles passed away. Back then, it felt like our little lifeline. Every spare bill or handful of coins went in there. It wasn't just about money, it was about possibility. We'd talk about where it might take us. A day trip to the coast, a new bike for Rachel, ice cream at the pier without counting change. I can still see her small hands pushing folded bills into the jar, her eyes sparkling like she was planting seeds for something magical. Sometimes she'd leave me little notes in there too. Drawings of seashells, stick figures of us on a beach, even a crooked heart with me and Mom scrawled inside. Those notes are still in a box upstairs. I couldn't throw them away even after the years turned them brittle. After Charles died, the jar became more than a tradition. It was proof that we could still plan for joy, even if it came in small doses. Rachel and I would sit at the kitchen table, counting what we'd saved, dreaming aloud. I'd picture her laughing on the sand, her face unburdened by the weight we carried. For a while, it worked. But dreams have a way of shifting when life intrudes. By the time Rachel was in high school, she had grown restless. She'd drift between friends, jobs, and interests like a wind-blown leaf, always searching for something brighter, faster, more exciting than what I could give her. The jar still sat in its place, but she barely noticed it anymore. I kept filling it alone. When Sophie was born, I thought maybe the cycle would change. Sophie had her mother's brown eyes, but a different kind of stillness. She liked to watch before she acted. Even as a toddler, she'd line up her toys in neat rows, sorting them by size or color without anyone teaching her to do so. As she grew, her quiet nature deepened. She wasn't shy. She was simply deliberate. Rachel, on the other hand, became more unpredictable. She'd move in for a few months, then vanish for weeks. Sometimes she'd bring Sophie along, sometimes not. Her explanations never matched the reality I pieced together from neighbors or the occasional late-night phone call. Still, I kept the summer jar where it had always been. It was my anchor, the one thing that stayed put when the people I loved seemed determined to drift away. Sophie noticed it too. A few years ago, she asked about it, and I told her the story. After that, she started adding her own savings, birthday money, coins from the couch cushions, even a few dollars she earned helping a neighbor weed her garden. It was mid-afternoon when I walked into the living room that day, drawn to the jar without really thinking. Sunlight slanted through the window, catching on the glass. Something about the way it looked made me pause. I reached for it, lifting it down from the shelf. The weight, or rather the lack of it, hit me first. I set it on the coffee table, my fingers working the lid loose. Inside, there was nothing but the faint smell of cedar from the wooden top. Not a single bill, not a single coin. Even the little notes Sophie had put in were gone. The lid slipped from my hand and clattered onto the table. I stood there staring at the empty glass, my pulse rising in my ears. The jar had never been completely empty, not in over 30 years. I told myself there could be a reasonable explanation. Maybe Sophie had moved the money for safekeeping. Maybe Rachel had borrowed it for groceries. But deep down, a heavier truth was already pressing in. The emptiness in that jar felt too familiar. It echoed the balance I'd seen on my bank statement just days before. I ran my thumb over the chipped letters on the front. The blue paint flaked under my touch, the way old promises do. My chest tightened, not with anger, but with the slow, suffocating squeeze of knowing that something you've nurtured has been taken from you without permission. From the kitchen, I heard Sophie's light footsteps moving upstairs. She was humming, soft and even, like she always did when she was focused on something. For a moment, I thought about calling her down, asking if she knew what had happened, but I didn't. Instead, I replaced the lid, set the jar back on the shelf, and sat in my chair facing the window. The harbor outside was calm, boats bobbing gently in the water. I sipped my cold tea and told myself I would wait. Answers have a way of finding their way to you, especially when you stop chasing them. But the feeling in my gut didn't fade. Something was moving beneath the surface of this quiet house, and I could no longer pretend not to feel it. That was the first moment I truly understood. The summer jar was empty, and so was the trust that had once filled this home. The sound reached me first, a heavy, uneven thump from upstairs, followed by the scrape of something dragged across the floor. I set down my mug and listened, the noise repeating every few seconds. A suitcase, I thought. I climbed the stairs, each creak of the steps louder in the quiet house. At the end of the hallway, Rachel's bedroom door stood open. She was there, hunched over the bed, shoving clothes into a black rolling carry-on. Her movements were quick, jerky, like someone racing a clock only she could hear. Going somewhere? My voice was calm, but I could hear the stiffness in it. Rachel didn't look up. "Boston," she said, yanking a sweater from the drawer and stuffing it in. "Just for a few days. Jake needs me." The name sat between us like a stone in water. I leaned against the doorframe, studying her. "A few days," I repeated. "You're leaving Sophie here?" She zipped one side of the suitcase with a sharp pull, still not meeting my eyes. "She'll be fine with you. You always take care of her." It was the kind of sentence meant to close a conversation, not open one. But I stayed where I was. "You could at least tell me why this is so sudden." Rachel froze for half a second, her hand hovering over the next drawer. Then she shook her head as if brushing off a stray thought. "It's complicated. I don't have time to explain." The air between us thickened. I noticed how she kept her gaze fixed on the clothes, on the suitcase, on anything but my face. I had seen that avoidance before, when she came home late in high school, smelling faintly of cigarettes, when she told me she'd dropped out of college but promised to enroll again, when she swore she'd never let anyone replace the bond we had. "You remember what you told me once?" I said quietly. "That no matter what, we'd always be a family, that we'd stick together." She finally looked at me, but only for a moment. There was something in her eyes, impatience maybe, or the unease of someone who knows she's breaking a promise, but doesn't want to feel it. "Things change, Mom," she said. I nodded, though the words stung. "They don't have to." She pressed her lips together, turned back to the bed, and folded a blouse with unnecessary precision. The suitcase was nearly full now, her life packed into a neat rectangle with wheels. Down the hall, Sophie's bedroom door was closed. I wondered if she knew her mother was leaving again, or if Rachel planned to slip out without a proper goodbye. I considered knocking, but something stopped me. If Sophie didn't know, I wasn't sure it was my place to tell her in that moment. Rachel stepped past me into the hallway, pulling the suitcase behind her. The wheels bumped over the uneven boards, the sound too loud in the stillness. She didn't slow as she headed for the stairs. I followed, not because I thought I could change her mind, but because some part of me couldn't let her walk out of sight without trying to understand. "Boston for a few days," I said again, trailing her to the front door. "And then what?" She opened the door without answering. The smell of her perfume, floral, sharp, expensive, drifted past me. It was the same scent she'd worn for years, the one that used to cling to my sweaters after she hugged me. Now it felt like a curtain closing, a cold sort of farewell. "Take care of Sophie," she said, stepping onto the porch. I stood in the doorway, the spring air brushing against my arms, and watched her roll the suitcase down the steps to the driveway. She didn't turn around. The car door slammed, the engine started, and a moment later she was gone. the sound of the tires fading into the distance. I stayed there for a long while, staring at the empty street. The sunlight caught on the dust motes in the air, turning them into tiny, aimless sparks. I could still smell her perfume, faint but insistent, clinging to the frame of the door. It reminded me of the way she used to wave from the school bus window, or the way she'd run up the walkway calling my name when she was small. But those memories felt far away now, as if they belonged to someone else's child. Behind me, the house settled into a heavier kind of quiet. I closed the door and leaned against it, the wood solid at my back. That was how she left. No warm hug, no promise to call, just the ghost of her scent in the air and the echo of wheels on the stairs. I told myself she'd be back in a few days, that this was just another one of her restless departures. But deep down, in the part of me that had learned to read the truth beneath her words, I knew something had shifted. And once something shifts, like that, it doesn't shift back. That night, the house felt larger than it had in years. Rachel's absence was a physical thing, leaving spaces in the air where her voice used to be. After dinner, I sat at the kitchen table, my laptop open, the glow of the screen casting long shadows across the wood. I hadn't planned to check my accounts. It was just a reflex, the kind of habit you build after a lifetime of living carefully. The first thing I saw was the balance in my checking account. My eyes skimmed the numbers, and for a moment, I thought I had read them wrong. I refreshed the page. The total was the same. Nearly everything was gone. I clicked over to my savings account. Empty. My credit card statements were a blur of charges. Electronics stores, high-end clothing boutiques, hotel reservations, charges I hadn't made. Then the worst blow, my retirement fund, the one I had left mostly untouched for 13 years, had been hit too. Several large withdrawals over the past 2 weeks, all routed through online transfers to an account I didn't recognize. The chair creaked beneath me as I leaned back, my hands suddenly cold. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt such a sharp, clean kind of betrayal. Money wasn't just money. It was the life Charles and I had built, the safety net we'd stretched tight for all the years after he died. And now it was gone, vanished with the same careless ease Rachel had packed her suitcase. Footsteps sounded from the stairs, light ones, unhurried. Sophie appeared in the doorway wearing an oversized sweatshirt and holding a mug of cocoa. She looked at me, then at the screen, her expression unreadable. "You saw it, didn't you?" she said quietly. I blinked. Saw what? Everything they took. She walked to the table, set her mug down, and slid into the chair across from me. My voice was careful. "Sophie, what do you know about this?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her sweatshirt pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. When she handed it to me, I saw it was a printed email, long with several messages stacked in the thread. The senders and recipients were all too familiar. I read the first line and felt my stomach twist. It was Rachel's email address writing to Jake. They were talking about liquidating assets, about using Mom's accounts because she won't notice right away. Jake's reply was worse. Details about how they'd move the money, what they'd buy first, and how soon they could leave for Florida. There were jokes about me buried between logistics, each one sharper than the last. I looked up at Sophie. Her gaze didn't waver. "How did you get this?" She reached for her laptop bag, pulled out the slim silver machine, and opened it on the table. The screen lit up, revealing folders labeled with dates and cryptic titles. She clicked through with swift precision until more documents appeared. Bank transfers, screenshots of Rachel's credit card purchases, hotel bookings under false names. "I started noticing things months ago," she said, her tone calm, almost clinical. "Jake was always around when Mom used the computer. She'd leave her email open. He'd make these phone calls outside, talking about flights and selling stuff. I just started saving what I found." The cocoa sat untouched. Beside her, steam curling lazily into the air. She leaned back in her chair. "I wasn't sure if I should tell you at first. I wanted proof, real proof. So I watched, and I waited. It was strange, hearing those words from a 12-year-old. Her composure, the methodical way she explained everything, reminded me of someone far older. I didn't know whether to feel proud or heartbroken. You knew they were going to take everything, I said slowly. Yes, she answered without hesitation. I closed the laptop gently, my fingers resting on the cool metal. And now you're showing me this because... Sophie's eyes softened, though her voice stayed steady. Because it's done. I've been tracking their moves for weeks. Every transfer they made, every account they touched, it's all documented. I sent it to the bank, the credit card company, even the police. They'll freeze everything before Mom and Jake can use it. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I studied her face, the calm determination, the quiet fire. She looked so much like Rachel had at that age, but there was something else in her, something Rachel had lost along the way. You did all this? Alone? She gave a small shrug. You were busy worrying about keeping us safe. I just handled the part you couldn't see. I exhaled, a slow release of tension I hadn't realized I was holding. There was no anger in me toward her, only a deep, aching gratitude mixed with sorrow that she had been forced to step into a role no child should have to play. Sophie took a sip of her cocoa, finally breaking her stillness. Then she set the mug down, met my eyes, and said, "Grandma, you don't need to do anything. I already set the trap." The words hung in the air between us, quiet but solid, like a door clicking shut. In that moment, I understood that the tide had already turned. 3 days passed with an almost eerie calm. The sky stayed clear, the harbor still, the rhythm of my small routines unbroken. I watered the plants in the window, read the paper in the mornings, and cooked dinner for Sophie each night. It was as if the storm had already moved on, leaving only the heavy quiet behind. That quiet cracked mid-morning on the 3rd day when my phone rang. Rachel's name flashed across the screen. I let it ring once before I picked up. "Mom!" Her voice was sharp, jagged like glass scattering across a floor. "What did you do? All the money is gone, everything. Jake's out of a job, the accounts are frozen, and the police..." She broke off, her breath coming fast. I took the phone from my ear for a moment, letting her voice become only a muffled noise. My other hand rested around the delicate handle of a pale blue porcelain teacup. It was one of the last gifts Rachel had given me when she was still in high school. Mother's Day, maybe 15 years ago. She'd saved her part-time wages for it, or so she said. I had unwrapped it at the kitchen table, her eyes bright with pride. Now, the cup sat warm in my palm, filled with chamomile. I traced the faint hairline crack that ran down one side, remembering how it had happened. An accident years ago when Rachel had been washing dishes and dropped it into the sink. She'd cried that day, afraid I would be angry. I wasn't. I told her some things can be repaired and still be beautiful. "Mom, are you listening to me?" Rachel's voice snapped me back. "Yes," I said softly, setting the cup down on its saucer. The china made the faintest chime. "They're saying we could lose everything. Jake says you went to the bank. You called the police. Her words tumbled over each other, frantic and accusing. I sipped my tea, letting the warmth spread through my chest. My voice stayed level, almost gentle. "Rachel, you might want to slow down and think about what you're saying." "I don't have time to slow down," she shouted. "They're coming here. Jake's furious. From the corner of my eye, I saw Sophie on the staircase, barefoot, her hair pulled into a loose braid. She moved quietly, her steps deliberate, like she'd been listening for a while. Without a word, she crossed the living room, stopped beside my chair, and held out her hand. I looked at her for a moment, then placed the phone in her palm. "You don't need to listen to this," she said, her voice calm, but carrying an edge of finality I had never heard from her before. I watched her lift the phone to her ear. "Hi, Mom," she said, her tone almost casual. "No, Grandma didn't do anything." "I did." There was a long pause on the line. I couldn't hear Rachel's words, but I saw the way Sophie's posture stayed straight, her chin slightly lifted. "You knew what you were doing," she continued, "and you knew it would hurt her. I'm not going to let you keep talking to her like that." I leaned back in my chair, the faint scent of chamomile rising from the cup beside me. This was the first time I'd seen the shift so clearly, the first power reversal. For years, I had been the one shielding Sophie from Rachel's volatility, explaining away her absences, softening her words. Now, Sophie stood between us, the protector. Rachel must have raised her voice because Sophie's expression tightened. "If you want to talk, you can talk to the police," she said simply, then pressed the red button to end the call. She set the phone on the table beside my teacup and sat across from me. For a moment, we said nothing. The air was filled only with the faint ticking of the clock on the wall and the distant hum of a boat engine on the water. "You didn't have to do that," I said quietly. "Yes," she replied, meeting my eyes. "I did." There was no bravado in her tone, only certainty. She reached for the teacup, turning it so the cracked side faced her. "You've been fixing things for her for as long as I can remember," she said. "Maybe it's time someone fixed things for you." I didn't trust my voice enough to answer. Instead, I reached out, covering her hand with mine. Her fingers were cool, steady, not the hands of a frightened child. Outside, the harbor shimmered under the midday sun, and for the first time in years, I felt the faintest shift inside me, like something long frozen had begun to thaw. That evening, the house had the kind of stillness that settles in after something decisive has been said. Sophie had gone upstairs for a while, the soft creak of the steps fading into silence. I stayed in the kitchen, the pale blue teacup still on the table beside me, the thin crack along its side catching the light. It had been years since the day Rachel broke it. I remembered kneeling by the sink, wiping up the shards while she hovered nearby, her eyes round and wet with guilt. "We can fix it," I had told her then. "It'll still be ours." I'd glued it back myself, but the seam had always been visible, a reminder that some breaks never truly disappear. I was rinsing my chamomile mug when Sophie's footsteps returned, steady this time. She carried a small wooden box in both hands, the kind with a sliding lid and compartments for tiny tools. Without a word, she set it on the table, pulled out a small tube of glue, a fine brush, and a small bottle with gold dust swirling inside. She held out her hand for the cup. I hesitated. "You don't have to," I said. Her gaze was steady. "I want to." I passed it to her, the porcelain warm from my touch. She turned it over in her hands, studying the seam with the concentration of someone looking at a puzzle. Then gently she began. First she used a small blade to scrape away the old adhesive. The sound was faint, like a whisper against the china. Bits of brittle glue fell onto the tablecloth. I watched her work, her fingers careful and sure. She never rushed, never forced a movement. She cleaned the edges with a cloth dipped in warm water, wiping away years of dust that had settled into the crack. The porcelain gleamed under the lamplight, and I noticed how her brow furrowed slightly as she aligned the broken edges again, testing their fit. When she was satisfied, she dipped the fine brush into the glue and traced a thin line along the fracture. Her hands were steady, each stroke deliberate. She pressed the edges together, holding them in place with a gentle pressure that somehow felt both fragile and strong. We didn't speak. The only sounds were the tick of the kitchen clock and the faint rustle of her movements. Time seemed to slow, stretching into the rhythm of her work. After a few moments, she opened the small bottle and tapped out a shimmer of gold dust into the glue's seam. It caught the light, scattering flecks of warmth across the table. She smoothed it carefully, creating a thin, gleaming vein where the crack had been. I realized then what she was doing. Kintsugi, the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with gold, making the flaw part of the object's history rather than something to hide. Her voice was quiet when she finally spoke. It's like people. Sometimes the breaks make them more beautiful. I felt my throat tighten. The room seemed warmer, the lamplight softer. When she finished, she placed the cup gently on the table to dry. Then she reached into the box one last time and pulled out a tiny slip of paper. She wrote something in her neat looping script and folded it small enough to fit under the cup. I lifted it and read the words. The crack is part of the cup. The simplicity of it struck me more than any long speech could have. I set the note back under the cup and rested my fingertips along the golden seam. The porcelain felt smooth, but the warmth I felt wasn't from the cup itself. It was from somewhere deeper, radiating outward until it reached my chest. Sophie leaned back, satisfied. It needs to sit overnight, she said. Then it'll be ready. I nodded, though my eyes were fixed on the glimmering line that now ran through the cup. It wasn't hidden anymore. It was illuminated, made into something new. In that moment, I realized the repair wasn't just for the cup. It was for me. Every silent disappointment, every broken promise, every moment I had patched myself back together in private. This was all of it, visible at last. And it didn't look like a flaw. It looked like proof I had survived. The clock ticked on. Sophie gathered her tools back into the box, slid the lid shut, and gave me a small smile before heading upstairs. I stayed at the table a while longer, my hand resting on the cup, feeling that golden seam under my fingertips. For the first time in years, the break didn't feel like a loss. It felt like the beginning of something whole. The next morning, I found Sophie at the kitchen table before breakfast, her laptop open and a neat stack of papers beside her. The pale blue cup we had repaired the night before sat to her right, catching a stripe of early sunlight through the blinds. "Sit," she said, sliding the papers toward me. I lowered myself into the chair, my hand brushing the golden seam of the cup as I reached for the stack. The first page was a summary, dates, amounts, and account numbers printed in neat columns. Behind it were bank statements, email printouts, and copies of transfers I hadn't authorized. There were screenshots of text messages between Rachel and Jake discussing how to clean out my accounts without alerting me. It was all here, laid out without sentiment, my entire financial dismantling documented in black and white. "How did you—" I began. Sophie didn't look up from her laptop. It wasn't hard. They weren't exactly careful. I just collected everything and made sure it couldn't disappear. I turned another page. Loan applications with my name typed neatly across the top, but addresses I didn't recognize. Credit card requests sent to a P.O. box in Boston. There were even forged signatures, crude enough to make my stomach turn. "This is enough for the police," I murmured. Sophie finally looked at me. "It's enough for more than that. You need someone who can make it stick." I frowned. "Meaning?" Before she could answer, my phone buzzed with a text from an unfamiliar number. It read, "This is Linda. Sophie said you might call. I'm free today if you want to talk." Linda. The name hit me with a sudden wash of memory. 10 years ago, she had been one of my 4th grade students. Quiet, whip-smart, the kind of child who asked questions no one else thought to ask. She had been the first in her family to go to college, and I had written her a recommendation letter for law school. "You reached out to Linda?" I asked Sophie. She nodded. "She's a lawyer now, criminal and financial law. I remembered you talking about her once, and I found her online. She said she'd help." 2 hours later, Linda was sitting in my living room, her leather briefcase balanced on her knees. She had grown into herself. Confident posture, clear eyes, the kind of presence that made you want to hand her your trust. "It's good to see you again, Mrs. Wade," she said warmly, though her gaze flicked to Sophie with something close to admiration. "I understand you've got quite the case here." Sophie didn't hesitate. She slid the stack of papers toward Linda, who began leafing through them with the same precision she must have once used on her law school exams. She didn't rush, but she didn't waste a second either. Forged signatures, identity theft, unauthorized withdrawals, Linda said, her tone even but firm. This isn't petty theft. This is a coordinated fraud. And because of the retirement account, we can argue it crosses federal lines. I watched her work, feeling an unexpected swell of pride. I had once stood at the front of a classroom, teaching her to read between the lines of a story, to find the truth behind the words. Now she was doing the same, only with the story of my own undoing. Linda looked up. "Do you want to pursue criminal charges?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. For a moment, I thought about Rachel as a little girl, about the scraped knees and late-night fevers, the nights she crawled into my bed after a nightmare. And then I thought about the empty accounts, the mocking tone in Jake's emails, the look in Sophie's eyes when she told me she'd set the trap. "Yes," I said finally. My voice didn't shake. Linda gave a single nod. "Then here's what we'll do. First, I'll get these to the district attorney's office. We'll file for an immediate freeze on any accounts they've touched. Then I'll work with the banks to reverse the transfers. Some of this money might take months to recover. Some might be gone. But they won't be able to touch another cent." Sophie leaned forward. "And Jake?" Linda's lips curved slightly, though it wasn't quite a smile. "If half of what's in here checks out, he'll be answering questions from law enforcement by the end of the week." I glanced at Sophie, and for the first time in days, I saw her shoulders relax just a fraction. Before Linda left, she paused at the door. "You know," she said, "when you wrote me that recommendation letter, you told me to use my voice for the people who haven't found theirs yet. I've never forgotten that. Consider this my way of returning the favor." After she was gone, I stood at the window for a long while, watching her car pull away. Sophie came to stand beside me, her hand slipping into mine. "Grandma," she said softly, "sometimes you just have to lay all the cards on the table." And that's exactly what we had done. By the next morning, Sophie had turned our dining table into a quiet command center. Her laptop sat open beside a legal pad covered in bullet points, arrows, and dates. The repaired blue teacup rested within reach, as if its golden seam had become our silent emblem. She didn't waste time. "Grandma," she said, fingers already tapping across the keys, "this is where we make the first move." Within an hour, she had compiled the cleanest, most damning pieces of evidence. Bank statements showing unauthorized transfers, screenshots of Rachel's texts to Jake, and the forged loan applications with my name attached. She uploaded them to 3 separate folders, labeling each one like a neat package: bank, employer, investigator. "Who gets which?" I asked, though I already knew she had decided. "Bank gets the full financial proof. They'll freeze anything connected to your accounts. Jake's employer gets the parts about him using company time and resources for the fraud, and the investigator gets everything." She clicked send 3 times in a row. The whoosh of each email felt like a card hitting the table in a high-stakes game. I didn't have to wait long to see the effects. By mid-afternoon, Sophie's phone lit up with a notification. Jake's employer had acknowledged receipt. The message was short and stripped of any warmth. "Your information has been passed to HR and legal. His access has been revoked." That night, Sophie refreshed the bank's online portal. "Accounts frozen," she said, her voice even but carrying a note of satisfaction. "Anything in his name or Rachel's is locked until further notice." I poured us each a glass of water, watching the reflection of the lamplight in the gold seam of the cup. The first strike had landed, and it had landed hard. By the following day, the calls began. At first, Rachel's number flashed on my phone once in the morning, once in the evening. I let both go to voicemail. The third day, she called 4 times. I didn't pick up. On the 5th day, the tone began to change. Her first voicemail that morning was sharp, biting. "You're making a huge mistake, Mom. This isn't what you think." Her second, just 3 hours later, sounded different. Less venom, more tremor. "Please call me back. We can fix this." I sat at the kitchen table with my hands wrapped. Around the repaired cup, the note Sophie had written. The crack is part of the cup, tucked beneath it. Silence was no longer the absence of action. It was the action. It was the boundary I had never held before. By that evening, she was calling every hour. Her messages turned from pleading to sobbing to angry again, like she was cycling through the drawers of an old, familiar script. One I used to answer every time, but I didn't answer now. Sophie noticed, of course. She was at the counter slicing apples for a pie when my phone lit up again. "You're not going to?" she asked. I shook my head. She's not talking to hear me. She's talking to get something from me. I don't have that to give anymore. She didn't smile, but there was a flicker in her eyes that looked like pride. The next morning I checked my phone. 23 missed calls, 11 voicemails. I deleted them all without pressing play. My hand didn't even tremble. It wasn't that I didn't care. It was that I had learned something Sophie seemed to have known instinctively. Silence can be sharper than any shouted word. The first strike wasn't about revenge. It was about removing their hold. And now, with their accounts frozen and Jake unemployed, the balance had shifted. For the first time in years, Rachel couldn't lean on my resources to cushion her mistakes. That night, as Sophie pulled the pie from the oven, she said quietly, "They'll push harder before they stop." "I know," I replied, taking the pie cutter from the drawer. "But this time, I'm not moving." The smell of baked apples and cinnamon filled the kitchen, blending with the steady tick of the wall clock. Somewhere across town, or maybe across the state, Rachel was dialing my number again, her voice ready to pour through the line. But the phone stayed face down on the counter, silent as the slice of pie I placed in front of Sophie. The silence was ours now, and it was stronger than anything Rachel or Jake had left. It was late afternoon when Sophie appeared in the doorway to the den, holding her laptop against her chest. Her expression was different, less the calm precision she'd shown all week, more something measured, as if she was weighing whether I was ready to hear what she'd found. "Grandma," she said softly, "there's something else, and it's bad." I set down the book I'd been pretending to read and gestured for her to sit. She placed the laptop on the coffee table, turned the screen toward me, and clicked open a folder labeled simply Jake. The first file was a spreadsheet. Names, addresses, phone numbers, amounts, columns of figures that climbed higher and higher until my eyes blurred. "What is this?" I asked. "His victims," Sophie replied. "All older couples, retired. Most of them lost their savings, just like you." She scrolled, and the list kept going. Over a dozen names, some with notes like mortgage default or foreclosure filed. How did you get this?" My voice felt too small for the room. I dug into his old email accounts. He wasn't careful. Used the same password for everything. These aren't just one-off cons. He's been doing this for years. And Grandma, the total's over $300,000. The number seemed to hang in the air, heavy and sharp. 300,000, all taken from people who had spent their lives building something, only to have it ripped away by a man who looked them in the eye and lied. Sophie clicked to another document, this one a scanned police report from 2 states away. The case had been closed without charges due to lack of sufficient evidence. But the names matched the spreadsheet. The pattern was unmistakable. I leaned back, feeling the edges of my composure shift. "This isn't just a bad man," I murmured. "This is calculated." Cold Sophie hesitated before speaking again. "There's more." The next folder held messages between Rachel and Jake, dated from almost a year ago. Sophie opened one, and my daughter's words glowed on the screen. "I know what you did before. I know about the other couples. But I believe you. I believe you can change." My breath caught. She knew. Sophie nodded slowly. She knew, Grandma. She just thought he'd stop for her. The weight of it settled into my chest, heavier than anger, heavier than grief. My own daughter had walked into the fire with her eyes open, and she dragged us both in with her. I stared at the screen, at the undeniable proof that Rachel had chosen him despite the truth. Images flashed in my mind. Rachel as a little girl clutching my hand on her first day of school. Rachel at 16 crying over her first heartbreak. Rachel at 25 promising she'd never let anyone come between us. Somewhere along the way, she'd learned to silence that promise. Or maybe she'd convinced herself that love could rewrite a man's nature. "I don't understand," I said finally, though I knew it wasn't a question Sophie could answer. "How do you look at someone who's done this and decide to trust them anyway?" Sophie closed the laptop gently. "Sometimes people see what they want to see, and sometimes they think they can fix someone because they're too afraid to admit they can't." Her words landed with the quiet weight of truth. The anger inside me was sharp, but it was tangled with something else, something softer and far more dangerous. Pity. Not for Jake, but for Rachel, for the small, stubborn hope that had blinded her until it cost us everything. I hated that I still felt it. I hated that, even with the proof in front of me, a part of me wanted to believe she'd been misled, that she hadn't truly understood what she was doing. But she had understood. She had chosen him anyway. The moral lines blurred, twisting in a way that made my head ache. I could despise what she had done and still ache for the daughter I had raised. I could want justice and still grieve the girl who used to run into my arms after school. Sophie must have seen the shift in my expression because she reached across the table and took my hand. "You can love her," she said, "and still not let her hurt you again." I looked at my granddaughter, this sharp, brave child who carried both my blood and a wisdom I'd taken decades to earn. And I knew she was right. The file on Jake was more than a record of crimes. It was a map of choices. And Rachel's name was on it, not as a victim, but as someone who had stood beside him. The knowledge didn't make me hate her. It made me see her clearly. And once you see someone clearly, you can't go back to pretending. That night, I placed the laptop in the drawer of my desk, locking it with the small brass key I'd kept for years. The truth was too big to ignore now, and too sharp to let anyone else cut me with it again. By the time it happened, the air in our house felt different, still but charged, like the quiet just before a storm finally breaks. Sophie had been working in near silence all morning, her phone never more than a few inches from her hand. Around noon, she looked up from the screen and met my eyes. "They're at a motel outside Worcester," she said. "Room 214. They've been there since last night." I didn't ask how she knew. By now, I had learned that Sophie's resourcefulness was both deep and unnervingly precise. She picked up her phone, tapped a few keys, and murmured, "Sending the coordinates now." Somewhere, miles away, Jake and Rachel were doing what they always did, circling the drain together. In my mind, I could see them in that room, blinds drawn tight, Rachel pacing while Jake barked orders into his phone, both of them convinced they still had moves left to play. Sophie set her phone down and poured herself a glass of water. "We wait," she said simply. It didn't take long. Less than 20 minutes later, her phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unfamiliar number. She answered on speaker. A calm, clipped voice introduced himself as Detective Harris. "We're outside the property now. Units are in place. Just confirming. Room 214? "That's correct," Sophie replied, her voice steady. "Stay on the line." What came next unfolded like a scene I was watching from two places at once. Our quiet kitchen and the chaos of that motel room. Through the thin, tinny connection, I heard it. A sudden, violent pounding on a door. "Police, open up!" The background noise cut sharply to Rachel's voice, high and panicked. "Jake, what do we do?" Muffled curses, the scrape of a chair toppling over, footsteps, another set of hard knocks, heavier this time. "Open the door, now!" Rachel's voice again, trembling. "We have rights!" Then Jake's barked reply, low and furious. "Shut up!" The sound of the door bursting inward drowned out whatever came next. Boots, thudding against cheap carpet. Someone shouting, "Hands where we can see them!" And then, the words that landed like a final card on the table. "Jake Morrison, you are under arrest. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law?" I could picture it as clearly as if I were there. Jake's swagger stripped away, Rachel frozen beside him, her eyes darting from one officer to another, trying to decide whether to speak or to vanish into herself. I didn't speak into the phone. I didn't need to. Instead, I reached for the pale blue teacup, feeling the warmth of the brew Sophie had poured minutes earlier. I lifted it to my lips, breathing in the faint aroma of chamomile and honey. The gold seam along its side caught the light, the repaired crack a reminder of something broken but remade. The voices on the line shifted, footsteps retreating, an officer's radio crackling. Then Rachel's voice, sharp with disbelief. "Mom, is that you? Are you listening?" I took a slow sip before answering. "Yes, Rachel, I'm here." There was a beat of silence, as if she were deciding which version of herself to put forward. Then she snapped, "You did this! You and—" I set the cup down, the sound of porcelain against wood punctuating her words. "Rachel, this was always going to happen. You just didn't think the day would come." On the other end, I heard the metallic click of handcuffs. Jake muttered something too low to catch, but the tone was pure venom. Detective Harris came back on the line. "Mrs. Wade, we have them in custody. We'll be in touch about statements and further proceedings." "Thank you, Detective," I said, my voice steady. The call ended. The kitchen was still again, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint clink as I set the cup back on its saucer. Sophie watched me, her expression unreadable. I looked at her and said, "The first chapter is over." She nodded. "But the book's not finished yet." Outside, a gust of wind rattled the windows, but inside the air felt lighter than it had in weeks. The storm had broken, not with shouting, not with vengeance, but with the quiet certainty that justice had finally taken its first step. And as I lifted the cup again, I realized the tea tasted different now, warmer, calmer, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. The weeks after the arrest felt like a slow unspooling of knots I had been carrying for years. Jake's trial moved quickly. Too quickly, it seemed, for the weight of what he had done. The evidence Sophie had uncovered left no room for the defense to wriggle. He was sentenced to 8 years in state prison, with no possibility of early release. Rachel's outcome was different but no less permanent. She avoided prison, but the court barred her from ever working in financial services again. She was ordered to repay the stolen funds, though the judge acknowledged that only a fraction could ever be recovered. Watching her in the courtroom, head bowed, I saw the final collapse of the defiance she had carried for so long. 2 months later, a plain white envelope arrived in the mail. Inside was a check for $19,200, the sum the state had been able to recover directly from frozen accounts in Rachel's name. It was a strange number, both too small to represent what was taken and too large to dismiss. I placed the check on the kitchen table and called Sophie over. She studied it with the seriousness of a banker reviewing a major deal. "We should put it somewhere safe," she said. "I was thinking," I replied, "we could start a new account, just ours. No one else's name." She tilted her head. "Like the summer jar, but grown up." The summer jar. My chest tightened at the thought. That glass jar had sat on the shelf in the hallway for decades, collecting coins and small bills each summer for a shared treat. Ice cream trips, a beach day, a movie night. It was a little tradition Rachel had loved as a child, and then one day it had been emptied without a word. I looked at Sophie and saw not the girl Rachel had been, but the young woman Sophie was becoming. Sharp, grounded, unwilling to let life's small safeties slip away without a fight. Yes, I said, exactly like the summer jar, but this time no one will touch it without both of us signing off. The next afternoon we went to the bank together. The teller, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes, slid the account forms toward us. "Names on the account?" she asked. "Eleanor Wade and Sophie Wade," I said. "No one else," Sophie added, her voice steady. The teller smiled faintly, tapping the keyboard. "Joint account. Requires both signatures for any withdrawals. We can add extra security alerts if you'd like." "Yes, please," I said without hesitation. By the time we walked out into the late autumn air, the account existed, real, tangible, and protected. Sophie held the folder with the account details against her chest as though it were made of gold. When we got home, I went to the hall closet and pulled down a small box from the top shelf. Inside was the summer jar, emptied long ago, but still intact. The faint scratches on its sides told the story of years' worth of hands reaching in, coins clinking against glass, the sound of childhood summers echoing faintly in memory. I washed the jar, dried it carefully, and placed it on the mantel in the living room. Beside it, I set a small frame holding the account's opening statement, $19,200, a starting point, not an ending. Sophie came in from the kitchen holding 2 mugs of tea. She saw the jar and smiled. "It feels right, doesn't it?" "It does," I said, taking the tea. "It's not about the money. It's about knowing it's ours. Safe, untouchable." She nodded, her gaze fixed on the jar. "And if we ever use it, it'll be for something we both believe in." For a long moment we stood there in the quiet, looking at the jar and the neat, black-inked numbers on the account statement. It was such a small thing, but it carried a weight that neither of us needed to put into words. What remained after everything, the betrayal, the theft, the years of looking over my shoulder, was this: a jar, a bank account, and the certainty that no one would decide for us again. It wasn't the fortune I'd once had, but it was ours, and that made it enough. The first snow came early as flour across the harbor roofs. It did not last, but it brightened the morning. I woke before the sun, brewed chamomile, and stood by the mantel where the summer jar caught a stripe of light beside the framed account statement. The house felt settled, quiet earned after effort at last. By 8, the kettle sang again. Sophie came down, earbuds looped around one finger, a notebook under her arm. "Homeroom, algebra, English," she said, snagging toast. "I can help in the yard between classes." She smiled and went upstairs. Later, I stepped onto the porch. The air bit, though the sun held a hint of kindness. Beds looked tired, stalks leaned, the soil had gone dull. I pulled on gloves and trimmed back what would not last through frost. During her break, Sophie joined me with the compost bin. She worked quickly, steady as a metronome. The same focus she used for evidence now went to dead stems and stubborn roots. We filled bags, forked in mulch, and tied twine so the rose cane would not snap when the wind changed. "You know," I said, tightening a knot, "your grandfather called winter the season of promises. You put the garden to bed, and it swears to wake." Sophie pushed hair off her forehead with her wrist. "Then let's make it a good promise." We finished by noon. She returned to history. I washed my hands and opened my laptop at the kitchen table. The blue cup sat to my right, its golden seam bright as a thin sunrise. A reminder blinked at the top of my screen, Community Safety Zoom at 5. Attendees, 14. It had been Sophie's idea. If we could fall into a trap, so could our neighbors. On the first Thursday each month, she ran a free session for seniors. We called it Harbor Hands. The library posted the link. The first meeting drew 5. Now regulars logged on early with questions and stories. At 4:45, Sophie set up in the dining room. She checked the webcam and taped a handwritten agenda to the monitor's edge. Passwords, authentication, romance cons, freezing credit, reporting theft. The chime sounded, squares bloomed. Mrs. Patel waved from a floral sofa. Mr. O'Rourke adjusted his hearing aids. Leon sat in a truck cab. Sophie welcomed them like a neighbor. "Today we practiced shutting the door," she said. She shared her screen and had them build a strong passphrase. They wrote it on paper, then typed it without looking. She demonstrated a credit freeze on a state site, pausing so everyone could catch up. When Mrs. Patel hesitated, Sophie asked which step looked confusing and retold it as a story about locking a shed with 2 latches. Questions came in a steady stream. What if a caller knows your address? What if an email carries the bank's logo? What if your nephew texts for help with an urgent tone? Sophie answered without rush. She talked about cues and timing, about pressure words, about pausing to feel your breath before clicking. She spoke about shame, how it keeps good people quiet, how silence helps thieves more than any software. Mr. O'Rourke described wiring money to a woman who claimed his grandson had been jailed. He used the word foolish. His face reddened. Sophie leaned toward the lens. "Not foolish," she said. "Human. Let's set a code word for your family, one only you know." He nodded, and a bit of weight slid off his shoulders. By the end, Leon typed that he had frozen his credit. The nurse promised to help her church group do the same. Mrs. Patel held up a list titled, "New Rules for My House." Sophie closed with a short checklist and posted a link to a printable guide. One by one, the squares winked out, each farewell warmer than the one before. When the screen went dark, the house shifted again. Not quieter, but fuller. Sophie sat back, rubbed her eyes, and smiled. 14 people, she said. That's 14 fewer doors left swinging. I set the blue cup before her. Steam rose. "You did good work," I said. She shook her head. "We did. You made them feel safe enough to ask." While she coiled the cables, I stood by the mantel. Rachel had needed an audience. She spoke in fireworks and left smoke. Sophie builds shelter, no fanfare, just sturdy beams and locks that click. I slipped $1 into the summer jar. The sound was light, but sure. Sophie added one and laughed. "Winter fund," she said. "For seed packets, for first cones in June." The harbor lights flickered on like small promises along the waterline. Winter had arrived, and for the first time in years, it did not feel cold. The morning after our harbor hand session, the mail came bound with a rubber band. Sophie set the stack by my tea. Flyers on top, a utility bill, a seed catalog promising hardy asters. At the bottom lay a white envelope with my name written in Rachel's hand. The sight slackened my breath. Her loops were the same as the ones on the notes she used to tuck into the summer jar. Those promises had once felt like sunlight. Sophie saw it and grew still. She rinsed her mug, dried it, and left the kitchen without comment. I turned the envelope over. No return address. A postmark from a town near the jail where Jake awaited transfer. The paper felt heavier than it looked, as if apology had a physical weight. I carried it to the sideboard beneath the mantel. The glass jar glinted beside the framed statement for our new account. I opened the drawer. Cedar lifted like a memory of old closets and careful keeping. I laid the envelope inside and closed the drawer. I did not break the seal. With my palms on the wood, I let the argument inside me speak its parts. One voice urged mercy now. Open it. Read. Remember the child who held out seashells and asked if they were worth saving. Another voice stood taller. Hold the line. Love does not rescue on command. Both voices belong to a mother. Only one would protect a future. Sophie returned and leaned against the doorway. "Do you want privacy?" she asked. "Or company?" "Neither," I said. "I want clarity." Her eyes traced the sideboard. She nodded once. She did not ask to see the letter. Respect can be silent and still be loud. We walked the harbor loop at dusk. The tide was low, skiffs tilted like sleeping dogs, ropes creaked against wooden posts. I told Sophie I had not read the letter. She did not praise or chastise me. She only matched my pace and said, "Sometimes not opening a door is the truest way to keep the house standing." We watched the last ferry cut a line across the water. I thought about the years of trying to be both shore and lighthouse for Rachel. How often I had run my light dry. After dinner, I brewed cocoa for Sophie and chamomile for myself. The repaired blue cup warmed my hands. The gold seam caught the lamp and turned it into a thin sunrise. I sat at the table and wrote a short card to Rachel. I told her I had received her letter. I said I wanted her to do the hard work of telling herself the truth. I said I wanted her to heal. I did not promise reconciliation. I did not bargain. I signed my name and left a wide margin of quiet. Before bed, I slid the card into the outgoing tray by the door. The house hummed its soft machinery. The clock measured a rhythm. Soft closure felt like this: not a slammed door, not a surrender, but a door resting in its frame. That night, I dreamed of the summer jar as a small lighthouse. Coins shone like lanterns behind glass. People carried letters along a narrow path. Some opened theirs at once. Some waited on a bench and read when the wind settled. The light swept them all with equal regard. Morning brought a bright wind that tapped the panes. I made oatmeal, then walked to the sideboard and opened the drawer 1 inch. The envelope lay where I had placed it, a quiet fact. I touched it with 2 fingers and closed the drawer. Today, I was not ready. That was not failure. It was respect for the boundary I had drawn. Sophie came down and poured cereal. Her look was a question. I shook my head. "Not yet," I said. She nodded. "When the time is right." We ate in an easy quiet. After she left for school, I sat by the mantel and looked at the jar and the framed statement for our account. Winter sun ran a pale ribbon across the floor. I thought about justice done without cruelty, about consequence that does not require hatred, about a kind of love that sets terms so love can survive. The letter can wait. I will read it when you are truly ready, and when I am ready to hear you as the woman you may yet become, not the girl who borrowed and vanished. Until then, the drawer can hold what I am not required to carry. I slipped $1 into the jar. It landed with a sure, gentle sound. Outside, gulls wrote brief shapes against the sky. Inside, the cup kept my hands warm. Morning light slips across the kitchen and settles on the mantel. I pour hot water over chamomile leaves and lift the pale blue cup. The gold seam gleams in the steam, a thin river of dawn running through porcelain that once broke and learned how to hold warmth again. I stand there for a breath, listening for the small sounds that tell me this house is alive. From down the hall, Sophie laughs. Keys clack in quick patterns as she finishes homework and drafts a new checklist for her Harbor Hands group. She reads lines out loud to test their rhythm. Use a passphrase. Freeze your credit. Call the bank from the number on your card, not from a link. The cadence of her voice is steady. She has found a way to turn fear into steps that anyone can follow. I carry my tea to the window and watch the harbor. The water is a soft pewter today. Gulls tilt and correct. The dock ropes lift and drop. Our summer jar rests on the mantel beside the framed page that shows our account's first balance. It is not fortune. It is a beginning. Yesterday I slipped $1 in for seed packets. Last night, Sophie added one for cones in June. We did not make a speech about it. We let the glass speak for us with a small, sure note. There are days when the past still taps like a knuckle on the door. I hear a siren and think of a motel room. I see a woman hurrying and think of a suitcase thumping the stairs. I do not invite those images in, yet I do not run from them. They belong to the story that brought us here. They are not the story that defines where we go next. Sophie calls from the dining room. She wants me to listen to a new introduction for her next session. I sit while she reads. Then we trim a sentence, add a phrase about shame, and simplify a step about two-factor authentication. She smiles when the flow clicks into place. That smile is the sound of a future building itself, one careful beam at a time. When she returns to her laptop, I open the sideboard drawer and look at the white envelope with my name. I touch it. I close the drawer. Not today. Grace can be a door you open from both sides. Mercy can be a boundary you keep with love in your hands. I write a single line on a note card and stand it by the jar. Keep the promise small and honest. Keep it daily. The kettle sighs again. I refill the cup and sit at the table where Sophie built our first case file. The wood holds the memory of scattered printouts and quiet courage. I can almost see my husband at the head of the table, nodding with that gentle pride he wore when students learned their first hard truth. He would like the way Sophie protects people she will never meet. In the afternoon, we pull on coats and walk the harbor loop. Wind threads through the masts and sets a low music humming. Sophie tells me a story about a caller who tried to scare Mrs. Patel into reading a code. She laughs as she describes how Mrs. Patel used the script Sophie taught and hung up without a fuss. Small victory, real safety. Back home, I sweep the porch and wipe the salt from the rail. Sophie heads upstairs. The keyboard resumes its even rhythm. The house is ordinary and bright. There's no grand finale here, only the quiet work of a life that has decided to keep itself. I pour the last of the tea and hold the warm weight of the cup in both hands. The golden seam catches the late sun and throws a thin line of light across my palm. I look at that line and say the words Sophie once tucked beneath this cup. The crack is part of the cup, and so am I. Before we say goodbye, we would love to know where you are watching. Is it a quiet morning with warm coffee or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Tell us in the comments. We read every one with gratitude. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe. Join a community that believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending time with us today. Wherever you are, I hope you carry this story with you. And remember, sometimes the miracle does not knock on your door. It waits quietly until you are truly ready to open your heart. Take care, and I will see you in the next story.